Now, 48 hours after the terrorist event that struck the Moscow uh, concert theater a few days ago, or a couple of days ago, some things are becoming a little bit more clear right now, and some things are actually getting a little bit more cloudy, especially in terms of what's going to come next. Because the most important thing is to figure out what's going to happen next, because the events that happened in Moscow definitely are not contained within Russia. They have potentially dramatic implications on what happens in the Russia-Ukraine war, and by extension on United States national security. So we are paying a great deal of attention to this, and we're going to continue tracking this all the way through because things are moving really fast. Now, today has actually been called a day of mourning in Russia. And there's been lots of special services. There have been large gatherings. People are bringing flowers to the site. There are also in many cities around Russia and allied countries are having memorials set up. All kinds of things you would expect in Russia. There's a lot of things that happen afterwards. This is actually the hall itself, you see, where they're trying to continue to look to see if they can find any victims that may be still under the rubble. It actually looks like some of the rubble of 9/11 in some regards, and certainly that's the way it's being viewed in Russia, with all the attendant emotions that went along with our trauma are now starting with Russia. And of course, like anybody who goes through these things, you have a lot of first sorrow, sadness, and then anger, and all those different kinds of stages of grief, etc. And we can be expecting that a lot of those are going to play out in Russia. And really, as we saw in the United States, our own reactions after 9/11, we overreacted in some ways, took actions that were turned out to be antithetical to our interest. It's happening right now in Israel, where Benjamin Netanyahu, after the October 7th terrorist attack, had definitely overreacted, and that's having negative repercussions. The question is going to be, will Putin follow in those same kinds of patterns, and will he also take action? Because today is a day of mourning, he has not made any additional comments because he wants to keep all the focus so far on the victims and their families. And so there hasn't been anything really officially in Russia today, though that's certainly going to come in the few days. But in the West, there has been some talk about some things because, as I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of ramifications for what happens next. And one of the first things that everyone's trying to ascertain is who was responsible. Now, ISIS, their official site, has claimed responsibility. So, right up front, there's that, because that's what ISIS claims. That's what many people around the world are claiming, that it was an ISIS operation. Ukraine immediately jumped out and said, as soon as this happened, that they had nothing to do with it, that this was nothing related to their country at all. The United States came out and says, well, as far as we know, it was ISIS. This fits into their pattern. We also put up on our show yesterday that the U.S. On the 7th and 8th of March put out a very specific warning where we said that in the next 48 hours, you need to watch out and don't go out in Moscow, because there could be the potential for terrorist activity in large gatherings, including concert halls. And that was very specific, and many Russians have picked up on that, implying that we have known. Now, since that time, U.S. Government officials have said, yes, we actually did get that notice. We actually did tell the Russians in this something to the effect of right to know, or some situation like that, is even though that Russia is in our crosshairs right now, we still let them know if we had actionable intelligence. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because there are some conflicting views on exactly what we knew and exactly what was going to happen. And it depends on which side you're on as to which side you may believe. But as I'm going to point out in a minute, there's a lot of different views here, and a great deal of it matters where you live, whether you live in Russia, you're on their side, or whether you live in the West, Ukraine, etc., on the other side. And not surprisingly, those views are very, very different. First of all, let's look at the United States. So Vice President Harris was asked today what she thought about this.
Vladimir Putin is already trying to link this to Ukraine and say that Ukraine is responsible. Does the U.S. have any evidence to back that up?
No, there is no whatsoever any evidence. And in fact, what we know to be the case is that ISIS-K is actually, by all accounts, responsible for what happened.
Yeah, it really should stand to reason that if we did, the last thing that the vice president is going to say on public television is, yeah, we knew it was them and they did it. And, we wish they hadn't have, but they did it. So I mean, that there's almost no other explanation when she's asked that. Definitely, that's going to be the response. So that's not really convincing in any way. And she wasn't even, quite frankly, really convincing there, as she said, well, as far as we know, it was ISIS-K. It seems to be them. So, her lack of confidence in that answer is certainly being picked up by lots of people around as well. Now, one person who was not lacking in zeal was Volodymyr Zelensky.
What happened yesterday in Moscow is obvious. Both Putin and other scoundrels simply try to blame everything on someone else. They always resort to the same methods. It's been done before. Yesterday, all this happened, and this absolute miserable Putin, instead of attending to his own citizens of Russia, addressing them, remained silent for a day, thinking about how to link this with Ukraine. Everything is absolutely predictable. Those hundreds of thousands of Russians who are now killing on Ukrainian land would surely be enough to stop any terrorists. And if the Russians are ready to silently die in Crocus halls and not ask any questions to their security and intelligence agencies, then Putin will try to turn such a situation to his personal advantage again.
Now, I cannot say for sure right now. I don't personally have enough knowledge or information exactly who did this. Was it ISIS as the way that's being portrayed? Were there other people involved? Did Kiev had any association? There is information that makes either plausible, but as I'll talk about here in a little bit, it's probably not going to even be possible for many years to come to know what actually happened. Much like what happened when the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated prior, the spark that caused World War I. There's a lot of disputes about what actually happened, what was said at the time and what was claimed and what was known behind the scenes, that there was a great deal of things behind that was going on that nobody knew about at the time, that a lot of different hands were involved with that. And it'll be the same situation here. We're not going to know for a long time, but it almost doesn't matter, because whichever side you come down on, whichever side you believe, you're going to disregard what the other side says and just say, oh, they're just wrong. What does matter, though, is what is Putin going to do? Now, the United States has its own issues here, and you just heard from the vice president. Well, Senator Marco Rubio, though, seems to be wanting to take this and use it for some of his own advantages here and bring some light to some of the things he says he believes. But in the process of doing that, he does expose some things here that I very much want to address, because he talks with certainty about some things about which he is dead wrong.
You think back to the end of 2020 under the Trump administration, ISIS was basically out of business. I mean, they were down to less than 1,000 fighters or so forth. And now they've reconstituted themselves. And part of it is, once we leave in Afghanistan, we're no longer there to conduct regular strikes. They can now operate openly. No matter how much the Taliban wants to take them on, they can't. They don't have the capability to do it. And these guys have found a place to operate from. They need real estate. They need land. They need places where they can organize and do external plotting. Now, it's a lot easier for them to get into Iran. It's a lot easier for them to get into Russia and do these things. But their aspirations go beyond Russia and Iran. They would love to do what they did in Moscow here inside the United States. And it's something we have to be very vigilant about when we have a border in which 9 million people have come across in the last 3 years.
Now, he starts off there by saying something that so many of these war firsters always do, which is we should never have left Afghanistan. We should have stayed there forever, because since we weren't there to stop them, that's why this kind of thing happened. And the Taliban can't handle it. We should have been. But look, that just belies an understanding of what the ISIS-K is, how they operate, how they don't operate, and how this particular mission took place here. He is wrong on every one of those counts here, but doesn't seem to bother him, or else he doesn't know. I don't know which it is. But let's look at some of them first of all. He said in there, they have a need for real estate. No, they don't. They do not have a need for real estate. This operation here had nothing to do with any real estate. If he had bothered to find out how this operation happened, he would have noticed that it came over Telegram. So by distant means, whoever did this found these guys who were following a certain ISIS preacher, and that part is legit, and everyone seems to agree on that part. And they were offered money and opportunity to do this terrible terrorist event and this terrorist activity. They were paid through a online means, for at least for part of it. And then they got their weapons through some other means as well. That part's still a little bit more cloudy. But this was not done in Afghanistan. It was not done in Tajikistan, which is apparently where these guys were from. It was done in Russia, where they were living at the time. And that's how terrorism is generally is going to work. It can be done from anywhere. I've been saying this since 2010 when I first or during my second combat deployment there, even before that. You don't need territory to do terrorist planning. 9/11 itself was not done by the geographic territory in Afghanistan, like so many claim to this day fraudulently or ignorantly. I don't know whether it's which it is. They probably don't know. So it probably isn't fraud. It's ignorance. But it wasn't. When you look at the 9/11 Commission report, that big, thick book that they published where they talked about every detail or so many of the details that happened, what you find out is that it happened by guys traveling from place to place, talking to people, getting on satellite phones, all different kinds of ways, online. So many different means were used there. The Afghanistan was only incidental, and the only reason it became an issue is because that's where Bin Laden was at the latter stages of that, where he was in Sudan before that. So it is completely a fallacy to say we need to, which is bad, because that's why people still say we have to stay in Iraq and Syria today with our troops, keeping them at unnecessary risk, because we have to be there. That's the only thing holding back. It's not holding anything back, my friend. That territory had absolutely zero to do with this terrorist attack in Russia here, and it will have zero to do with any other one, because they don't need territory. All they need is a phone and an email address. That's all they would need, and then they can be literally anywhere in the world. Next is, he said that we have tracked it and warned Russia about this. So you talk about, the differences between our country and their country. If this had been the United States and these people were planning something, our intelligence services has made dramatic improvements since 9/11. Its ability to take down terrorists, because we are monitoring things all the time. And so when these things I just mentioned that need to happen over communication means, we're there to intercept a lot of them, especially internationally. And apparently we knew this was coming. As I showed you a minute ago, we warned the Russians on the 7th and 8th of March that there was something coming imminently. And that's because we apparently had some knowledge about this plan. And so if it had been the United States, we would have been able to take a lot more action, but we didn't have the power in another country. So whatever the Russians did with that warning is something they'll have to answer for at some point. But the bottom line is we were tracking that. And if it had been in our country, it wouldn't. So this thought that we have to go back to Afghanistan because we have to keep bombing them, that also shows that he has no idea what our troops were doing there when they were there. There was only a small handful of troops, 2,500 in the entire country, when there had been 150,000 when I was there. And even that was insufficient to completely control the Taliban or ISIS-K, which started coming up during that time. Our presence there never knocked ISIS-K out, period, and it never would. So that's an important thing to recognize here. Don't try to use this to say, see, we should never have left Afghanistan, and so we should never leave Syria or Iraq. That's dead wrong, because we should do both of those things, because that's not how we keep our country safe. I wish more people understood that. Then one of the other things she says is that he doesn't understand how ISIS works, because ISIS, they do many different things, many different kinds of operations. One way is that they train suicide bombers, and they go into places and blow things up. The other way is what happened allegedly here in Russia, where they find people who are already in the country and then try to mobilize them and radicalize them, or pay them whatever needs to be done so that they operate there. So they didn't come in from the outside, as Senator Rubio said. Those people were already in, and they were contacted via note. So literally in every way, nearly everything that Senator Rubio said there was wrong. Now, let's move on to Vladimir Putin. He said yesterday a number of things, but here were some of the more important ones.
I am addressing you in regards to the bloody barbaric act of terror that killed dozens of peaceful people who were not guilty of anything, our fellow citizens, including children, teenagers, and women. The main thing is to not let those behind this bloodbath commit new crimes. Regarding the investigation of this crime and results of operational search actions, I can now say the following. All 4 of the actual perpetrators of the act of terror, all those who shot and killed people, were found and detained. They tried to hide and were moving in the direction of Ukraine. There, according to the preliminary information, they had a crossing of the border prepared from the Ukrainian side. Overall, 11 people were detained. All the executors, planners, and those who ordered this crime will be rightfully and inevitably punished, whoever they are and whoever directed them.
So that therein is your trouble. When we're trying to ascertain what's going to come next, those last few lines that Putin said there are among some of the more concerning, because he said they will pay for this, whoever they were, whoever helped organize it. And he left that open-ended by design, because and from what we now know, from what's being reported out of Russia, they were able to track these guys shortly after the four people after they left the venue. And then they found out where they were going, and they saw that they were heading toward the Ukraine border. And then apparently, before they had a chance to actually get across, and for there's any risk to lose them, that's when they finally intercepted them. Apparently, they had been tracking them for quite a long time before they finally started to intercept the vehicle and to capture all of the people there. Now, the fact that they were heading into Ukraine and to heading down into trying to cross into Ukraine, and there was allegedly a door open. And this is where we get into the fuzzy part, because there's no way to validate any of that's true. Many, of course, in the Ukraine side are saying this was actually a false flag on the Russian side. They planned this whole thing and they killed all their people to validate whatever Putin's going to do next. Now, that seems unlikely to me, but I can't prove that it's not. That's actually a theoretical possibility. It's also a theoretical possibility that the ISIS did this just as it says, because they have attacked quite a number of other people. But it's also theoretically possible that Ukraine did have something to do this, because these guys, according to their testimony so far, is that they didn't know who they were talking to. They were just talking to someone who's contacting them via the Telegram channel. Now, others will point to the fact that, well, these guys had videos that were uploaded on the official ISIS website, and it was put out by the official ISIS people, so that proves that it was. Well, it could be. There is also a theory run around and making lots of rounds on the Russian side that was actually part of the process here, because there was some evidence, so they say, that initially ISIS was caught by surprise for this. They didn't know it was coming in. But then when these videos get passed along to keep up the image that this was the ISIS only, is that then they were only too happy to take credit for it, because they benefit from that. Because they do dislike Russia for some of the things that they've done. And so they were only too happy to see their flag flying and these guys taking actions that they do themselves, like they mutilated some of the bodies in some of the most horrific ways you can imagine afterwards. So what's the bottom line here? It could have been Russia did it to themselves. It could have been that Ukraine helped ISIS and framed ISIS, frankly, or it could be that ISIS did it. So all those things are possible. But you know what, folks? It also doesn't really matter right now what actually happened, because what does matter so much is what is Russia going to do about it. Now, as Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, now still tied very tightly to the upper echelons of the Russian government, put out a statement shortly after this terrorist event happened, in which he said, "Terrorists only understand retaliatory terror. No trials or investigations will help if force is not countered by force, and deaths are not met with the total executions of terrorists and repressions against their families. If it is established that these terrorists are of the Kiev regime, it is impossible to deal with them and their ideological inspirers in any other way. All of them must be found and ruthlessly destroyed, including officials of the state that committed such atrocity. Death for death," he said. And that is similar language to some things that President Putin said not long after that. So the question is going to be, whatever did happen, is Russia going to try to use this to escalate the war? And it's entirely possible that they could, because just like George Bush did after 9/11, just like Benjamin Netanyahu did after October the 7th terror attacks, Vladimir Putin can nearly do anything he wants to, and nobody in Russia is going to question him. He has a lot of power to do things. And I've heard some people say, well, what more could Russia do? They're already fully engaged with the war with Ukraine. They can do a lot more, folks. They have restrained themselves from many targets that could be attacked that they haven't attacked so far. For example, they haven't gone after any of the power ministry buildings in Kiev. They've gone after other targets in Kiev, mainly with energy targets and other military infrastructure that has to do with supporting the war, but they haven't gone after those main buildings so far of any of the ministries. Many have wondered why they didn't from the beginning. They could go after that. Some on Russian channels this morning are speculating that maybe what Medvedev and maybe even what Putin meant is that they're going to finally go after Zelensky and take him out. That's what he said, with whoever was responsible. I personally don't think that Putin would do that, not for any moral means, but because I think that would be counterproductive to take out the head of state. That would cost Russia so much more than any kind of feeling of retribution for what happened here or satisfy their population. I don't think that he would do that, but you can't take it off the list. Other officials, however, maybe they're not so safe, especially Budanov, who's the head of one of their intelligence communities, or several of these others. They have a couple of main intelligence branches. They may be, if Russia chooses to claim that they were responsible, those ministries could face a lot of attacks, and some of the leaders especially. Russia has not gone after the leaders of really of anything other than at the tactical level so far. That could change. So they've been going after lots of energy infrastructure. There's been a big missile barrage that actually preceded this whole operation here that showed that Russia apparently is on the beginning of a big offensive push that they're going to do throughout the country, beginning potentially as early as May of this year or maybe June. On top of the methodical offensive operation they've been doing at the tactical level for months now, it's possible that they could change targets and go to something higher profile, something more painful to the Ukrainian people that so far they have stayed off of. The question then is going to be, what is the West going to do in response to that? Because depending on how high Russia ratchets up, that may ratchet up the desire and the calls of many on the Western side who were already saying, hey, we need to do more. Of course, you saw on our show not long ago that the president of France, Macron, was wanting to say, maybe we'll send troops there. Poland said, maybe we'll send troops there. Lithuania, same kind of situation. Those calls can certainly go up if Russia escalates this situation, because then they'll have a greater fear, especially those that are on the eastern flank of NATO may have a greater fear that they're going to be next, or that Russia is going to expand the war. Now, as I've said many, many times and want to emphatically repeat here, Russia does not have the conventional capacity to advance the war anywhere. It will absolutely max them out if they take any more territory, even in the eastern part of Ukraine. If they take more territory, say up to the Dnieper River, which would be a massive undertaking. That's all they have. And it's definitely not clear that they can accomplish even that. But there is no prospect that Russia can go anywhere into a NATO country, because he knows full well, Vladimir Putin, that an inch into NATO territory doesn't mean one country, it means 32. And that's just how NATO works. And he's fully aware of that, which is one of the reasons why he wants a buffer between him and NATO. He doesn't want to conquer territory and make himself right next to NATO in that area. He wants a buffer. So he does want an independent Ukraine of some sort, even if it's a neutered one. He wants that. In fact, he wants a neutered one because he doesn't want to be on the border with Russia, with NATO. So we need to be clear on that. So whatever fears people may have after Russia does whatever it's going to do, we need to be clear-eyed and not emotional, and understanding that there is no conventional threat from Russia and won't be for a decade or more. And that's assuming they actually go on an offensive capacity to build up the capacity to do that, especially logistically, which they currently don't have. There's no evidence that they would want to do that, but at the very worst, the most fearful you could be, it would be a decade out if they made such a decision. Very, very likely they won't. So we need to make sure that we don't escalate this beyond whatever Russia does. We need to contain this to keep it from escalating, because, folks, the big danger is not a conventional escalation. It's a nuclear escalation. And if things get out of hand, it is too many people have been talking about how they're willing to use nuclear weapons. I heard Ben Hodges a week or so ago emphatically say there's zero chance that Russia would ever use a nuclear weapon. So it's just self-deterrence on our part. So just don't listen to them. That is nonsense. And that is dangerous nonsense, to have this unhinged belief that we can literally do anything and that Russia will never use nuclear weapons, even though it's in their doctrine and they have thousands of them to use. It is a foolish gamble to take, and one that we need not take. Listen, there's one thing we need to understand here at the end, and I'm going to close with this. In major war, I know we have the Geneva Conventions and the rule of law and the laws of war, the things that govern those things always are talked about, like after World War II, for example, which is where a lot of these come from. Those are all things we should aspire to. But when the reality is, for most nations, when they get into an all-out war, there is no morality. They will do whatever it takes to win. They will take any action that is necessary to win. They will lie and say anything necessary to win to deceive their enemies. They'll do whatever it takes. And that means Russia, that means Ukraine, and that means nearly anyone who's involved with this. If you don't believe that, then we're being too naive. It would be great if everybody followed the laws of land warfare, which I'm a strong advocate of and want to hold our country, have always had during my entire career. It's so important to hold our troops to those standards. We should follow the laws of land warfare, even if it's tactically to our disadvantage in some cases, because it is better in the long run. But most nations don't follow that. They follow there is no morality but winning, and they'll do whatever it takes. And there is nothing that they won't do. And that especially plays here, because it is theoretically possible and would not shock me to find out that Russia actually did this to themselves. I don't have any evidence that they did. But if we found out later that they did, that would not be shocking. It would not be shocking me in the least that Ukraine had something to do with this, that they did use ISIS people as a cover for this activity. Would not surprise me in the least, because they will do whatever it takes to win. And both of these sides lie incessantly. It's very difficult to take anything anyone says at face value, because so often it's proven to be inaccurate. The only thing we can know is what has happened on the ground. We know there was a terrorist attack. We know the people who've committed the atrocity. And that's almost all we know for sure, because everything else is fuzzy. What's going to make so much difference and what will matter a lot is what Russia does and what our response to that is going to be in the coming days. And we have to be clear-eyed and unemotional in our response to do everything necessary for our own national security to keep this war contained. We dare not let it expand beyond out of some kind of an emotional response to whatever Putin may do. There's diplomatic actions, there's economic actions, there's other things that you can do depending on how they respond. But as long as they don't attack us or NATO, we must make sure this war doesn't expand. That's what we have for you today. We have some great shows. We have Ian Puttick from London coming on tomorrow. We've got some great shows later this week too. We have Doug McGregor, we have John Mearsheimer. Lots of folks you're going to want to come and see today, because they have some great things to say on all these things, and they're going to continue to evolve. And especially now that this day of mourning is over in Russia, many new things could come out tomorrow, and we'll be watching a lot of that. But we thank you for coming on our show. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised for you. And that was the other thing. Yeah, that's one of the answers specifically tomorrow. Ed King from Defense Priorities is going to be talking about, what is going on with the terror attack that's in Russia, and is the United States going to be benefited by increasing the number of troops we have into Europe? Is that even in our interest? We're going to talk about that tomorrow. You won't want to miss that one. Thanks for liking. And please do, folks, share this with as many people as you can, because, the kind of analysis we bring here, and especially the guests that we have on, it's just stuff that you don't get many other places, and too many people just keep things at the surface level. Come here to find the truth, and we will see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.